Marcus Chen stood in the hospital billing office, his signature still wet on divorce papers he'd served his wife Sarah just 3 hours earlier, demanding to know why his mother's dialysis payments had suddenly stopped. What he didn't know was that the quiet librarian he'd just divorced for his ambitious colleague Rebecca was actually the anonymous benefactor who'd been covering those $4,500 weekly treatments for the past 2 years, the secret owner of Chen Medical Holdings that had acquired his family's failing pharmaceutical company, and the reason his mother was still alive despite their insurance denials. His plan had been simple. Divorce Sarah immediately after confirming her pregnancy wasn't going to trap him in a loveless marriage, marry Rebecca who had connections and ambition that could advance his career, and finally escape what he considered a colossal mistake made during a moment of weakness 3 years ago. But when his mother Helen collapsed in the dialysis center that afternoon, screaming at the nurses about medical incompetence while her son stood helpless, neither of them realized that the payment authorization they were desperately seeking required approval from Sarah Morrison Chen, CEO of Morrison Medical Ventures, the woman Marcus had just served with divorce papers in the library where she worked part-time to maintain her cover. The arrival of hospital administrators and a team of corporate attorneys wasn't coincidental. They came to inform Marcus that his mother's dialysis, his father's cancer treatments, his sister's fertility procedures, and even the roof over his parents' heads were all controlled by Morrison Medical Ventures, and that the CEO was currently 6 months pregnant with his child, sitting alone in their apartment deciding whether his family deserved to continue receiving medical care they couldn't afford. How long would it take Marcus to connect the dots between the mysterious benefactor his family had praised for years and his wife's maiden name? What would Helen do when she realized the woman she'd called useless and worthless had been keeping her alive? And what revenge would a betrayed billionaire exact on a family that chose a mistress over their pregnant wife while unknowingly depending on her charity for their very survival? The fluorescent lights in Valley Medical Center's dialysis wing hummed with the same mechanical indifference they'd maintained for the past 15 years, casting harsh shadows across Helen Chen's face as she reclined in the treatment chair, tubes running from her arms to the machine that had become as essential to her existence as oxygen. Her kidneys had failed in 2009, a consequence of undiagnosed diabetes that had ravaged her body while she'd worked 3 jobs to put her son Marcus through medical school, sacrificing her health for his future in the way that immigrant mothers had done for generations, believing that their children's success would somehow justify the cost. Marcus stood beside her chair, his hand resting on her shoulder with practiced affection that Sarah had learned to recognize as performance rather than genuine tenderness. He'd always been attentive to his mother in public, posting photos of their time together on social media with captions about family values and filial duty, but Sarah had witnessed the irritation in his voice when Helen called during inconvenient moments, the way he'd silence her calls during dinner or complain about her neediness when he thought Sarah wasn't listening. Sarah Morrison Chen sat in the waiting area, her 6-month pregnant belly making the plastic chairs even more uncomfortable than they were designed to be, watching her husband through the glass partition that separated the treatment area from the family lounge. She'd accompanied Helen to dialysis every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years, ever since Helen's insurance had denied coverage and Sarah had quietly arranged for Morrison Medical Ventures to cover the costs through an anonymous charitable foundation that couldn't be traced back to her. What Marcus didn't know, what his entire family didn't know, was that the quiet woman they dismissed as a fortunate nobody who'd somehow trapped their brilliant son was actually the heir to Morrison Medical Ventures, a pharmaceutical and healthcare empire her grandmother had founded in 1952, and that Sarah had transformed from a modest regional operation into a $23 billion international conglomerate. The librarian persona she'd maintained throughout their 3-year marriage hadn't been deception exactly, but rather a carefully constructed test. One that Marcus had failed so spectacularly that Sarah sometimes wondered if the man she'd married had ever actually existed, or if she'd simply projected her desires onto someone who'd been performing a role during their courtship. Her grandmother had warned her, of course, had questioned Marcus's intentions when he proposed after just 4 months of dating. But Sarah had been convinced that Marcus loved her for who she was rather than what she could provide, that his modest background and hard-working immigrant parents meant he valued character over wealth. 2 years ago, when Marcus's father's pharmaceutical supply company had faced bankruptcy due to changes in healthcare regulations and mounting debt, Sarah had used Morrison Medical Ventures to anonymously acquire Chen Pharmaceuticals for $340 million, restructuring their operations and saving 800 jobs while Marcus complained over dinner about corporate vultures who'd stolen his father's legacy, never once suspecting that the vulture reading beside him in bed was actually his wife. She'd also taken over Helen's medical expenses when their insurance company had denied dialysis coverage, citing pre-existing conditions and lifetime maximums that would have left Helen with impossible choices between treatment and financial ruin. Sarah had set up the anonymous foundation, arranged for seamless payment processing, and ensured that Helen never knew her daughter-in-law was the reason she was still alive. The glass door to the treatment area opened, and Marcus emerged with an expression Sarah had learned to read over 3 years of marriage. Irritation mixed with poorly concealed resentment, the look he wore whenever his mother's medical needs interfered with his plans. He'd been planning to take Rebecca Martinez to the medical conference in San Diego this weekend, a trip that was supposed to be the beginning of their public relationship, but Helen's sudden complications had forced him to cancel. Sarah watched him approach, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly as if the baby could sense the tension radiating from its father. Marcus stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak quietly but maintaining the physical distance that had characterized their marriage for the past year. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice carrying that clipped professional tone he used when he wanted to establish authority. "But not here. Not with my mother watching." Sarah stood slowly, her pregnancy making quick movements difficult, and followed Marcus through the hospital corridors to the small courtyard where patients and families went to escape the antiseptic smell and constant beeping of medical equipment. The October sun was bright but provided no warmth, and Sarah wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as Marcus pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. She recognized the envelope immediately. She'd seen enough legal documents in her corporate life to know divorce papers when she saw them. But the timing, the sheer calculated cruelty of serving them while his mother was connected to a dialysis machine, took her breath away in a way that even his affair with Rebecca hadn't managed to accomplish. "I've been unhappy for a long time," Marcus began, and Sarah almost laughed at the script he'd apparently rehearsed. "We both know this marriage was a mistake. You're a good person, Sarah, but we're not compatible. We want different things. You're content with your little library job and your quiet life, and I need someone who understands my ambitions, who can be a partner in building something significant." He handed her the envelope with fingers that didn't tremble, his expression suggesting he believed he was being kind by being direct, that this honest cruelty was somehow better than prolonged dishonesty. "My attorney says it's better to handle this now rather than after the baby is born. We can establish custody arrangements and child support, and both move forward with our lives. Rebecca and I are planning to get married in December, and I'd like this to be finalized before then." Sarah took the envelope with numb fingers, her mind struggling to process that the man she'd married was actually serving her divorce papers in a hospital courtyard while his mother underwent dialysis treatments that Sarah was secretly paying for, while carrying his child, while maintaining the fiction that she was a simple librarian rather than the billionaire who controlled his entire family's financial survival. She didn't open the envelope, didn't look at the papers inside, just held it against her chest while Marcus continued speaking, outlining his expectations for their separation with the same clinical detachment he probably used when discussing pharmaceutical profit margins. He wanted to keep the house, wanted primary custody with Sarah having visitation rights, wanted her to sign quickly and quietly without making things difficult or embarrassing for his family. "What about your mother's dialysis?" Sarah heard herself ask, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. "What about your father's cancer treatments? Your sister's fertility procedures? How will you afford all of that without the mysterious benefactor who's been covering everything for the past 2 years?" Marcus's expression flickered with irritation at what he clearly perceived as Sarah trying to make him feel guilty. "The foundation will continue covering mother's treatments. They've been doing it for years. That's not going to change just because we're getting divorced. And father's treatments are covered by his new insurance through the company that bought his business. We'll be fine, Sarah. You don't need to worry about my family. We've always taken care of ourselves." Sarah looked at her husband, at the man who'd whispered promises of forever while making love to her, who'd cried when she told him she was pregnant, who'd held her hand through her grandmother's funeral 6 months ago and sworn he'd always be there for her, and she saw absolutely no recognition in his eyes that he was destroying the very person who'd been holding his family together. "Sign the papers," Marcus said, checking his watch with obvious impatience. "My attorney needs them by Friday so we can file next week. Rebecca and I want to start our lives together without this hanging over us." He walked away without waiting for a response, back toward the dialysis wing where his mother was still connected to machines that Sarah's money was keeping operational, and Sarah stood alone in the courtyard feeling the baby kick as if protesting the conversation it couldn't understand but could somehow sense was significant. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Martinez, her head of legal affairs. "Mrs. Chen, we've received notice that Marcus Chen has filed for divorce. Recommend immediate review of all financial obligations and corporate relationships with Chen family members. Awaiting your instructions. Sarah looked at the envelope in her hands, at the divorce papers that would legally end her marriage while beginning something else entirely, and she made a decision that would change everything. She texted back 5 words: terminate all unauthorized charitable distributions. Helen Chen had been receiving dialysis 3 times a week for 15 years, a routine so ingrained in her existence that she could navigate the hospital corridors in her sleep, knew every nurse by name, could anticipate the beeping patterns of different machines and what they signified. But she'd never experienced what happened 3 days after Marcus served Sarah with divorce papers, when she arrived for her Thursday treatment and was escorted not to her usual chair but to an administrator's office on the 3rd floor. The administrator, a nervous man in his 40s named Robert Walsh, sat behind a desk covered in documents that Helen couldn't quite read from her position in the uncomfortable visitor's chair. Marcus sat beside her, his expression confident in that way he had when dealing with what he considered lesser bureaucrats, clearly expecting to intimidate this administrator into resolving whatever minor billing issue had caused this inconvenience. "Mrs. Chen," Robert began, his hands clasped together on the desk with white-knuckled tension. "I'm afraid there's been a significant change in your payment arrangements. The Morrison Medical Foundation, which has been covering your dialysis costs for the past 2 years, has terminated its charitable support effective immediately. Without insurance coverage or alternative payment arrangements, we cannot continue providing treatment." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, visible and choking and impossible to escape. Helen stared at Robert, certain she'd misheard him, because the foundation had been her salvation, her miracle, the anonymous blessing that had appeared exactly when she'd needed it most. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used when he believed he was obviously correct and just needed others to recognize his superiority. "The foundation has been covering my mother's treatments for years. They don't just stop without notice. What kind of organization operates like that?" Robert pulled out a document and slid it across the desk, and Helen saw legal letterhead that made her eyes blur with tears she refused to let fall. "The foundation provided written notice 3 days ago that all distributions to the Chen family would be terminated immediately. This includes your mother's dialysis, your father's cancer medications, and your sister's fertility treatments. The total monthly obligation was approximately $47,000. Marcus went pale, the blood draining from his face as he processed numbers that clearly hadn't been part of his calculations when he'd filed for divorce. $47,000 a month? That's impossible. Mother's dialysis is expensive but not that expensive. What are you talking about? The foundation covered the full cost of treatment, not just co-pays, Robert explained, sliding another document across the desk. Your mother's dialysis runs approximately $18,000 per month. Your father's cancer medications are $22,000. Your sister's fertility treatments have been $7,000 monthly. The foundation covered everything your insurance denied, which was substantial given the pre-existing condition clauses and lifetime maximums. Helen felt something crack inside her chest, a breaking that had nothing to do with her failing kidneys and everything to do with the sudden realization that her family's survival had been dependent on charity they'd never properly appreciated, on generosity from strangers they'd never properly thanked. "Who runs this foundation?" Helen demanded, her voice shaking with fear and rising anger. "I want to speak with them. I want to know why they're doing this. Did we do something wrong? Did someone file a complaint?" Robert hesitated, his eyes moving between Helen and Marcus with obvious discomfort. "The foundation is a private entity controlled by Morrison Medical Ventures. The CEO makes all distribution decisions personally. If you want to appeal the termination, you'll need to contact Morrison Medical directly." "Then give me their number," Marcus snapped, pulling out his phone with shaking fingers. "I'll call them right now. This is ridiculous. My mother is dying without these treatments. They can't just cut her off without warning." "They provided 72 hours notice," Robert corrected gently. "And the documentation states that the termination was due to violation of ethical standards and good faith requirements outlined in the original grant agreement. Specifically, that charitable recipients are expected to maintain basic standards of honesty and decency in their personal relationships." The office went silent except for the sound of Helen's labored breathing, and Sarah could almost hear the exact moment when Marcus started connecting dots he should have connected days ago. Morrison Medical Ventures. Morrison Foundation. Sarah Morrison Chen. The wife he'd just divorced, who'd always seemed to have money despite her modest library salary, who'd never asked him for financial support, who'd quietly paid for things without explanation. "What's the CEO's name?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Morrison Chen," Robert said, and Helen watched her son's face cycle through expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion giving way to disbelief. Disbelief morphing into horror. Horror settling into rage so pure that Helen almost didn't recognize her own child. "Sarah?" Marcus repeated, as if testing the name against reality he'd constructed. "My wife Sarah? The librarian?" "Your ex-wife," Robert corrected, checking his documents. "According to our records, divorce papers were filed 3 days ago. The foundation termination notice was submitted approximately 2 hours after those papers were served." Helen turned to look at her son, at the man she'd sacrificed her health to educate, and she saw guilt flash across his face before being quickly replaced by defensive anger. "You divorced Sarah? What? You never told me you were having problems. What happened?" Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against linoleum with a sound that made Robert flinch. "This is insane. Sarah works in a library. She drives a 10-year-old Honda. She shops at Target. She's not the CEO of anything. This is a mistake. Someone has the same name, or there's been identity confusion or something. Mrs. Sarah Morrison Chen is definitely the CEO of Morrison Medical Ventures," Robert said, pulling up something on his computer and turning the screen so they could see. "She's been CEO for 8 years, took over from her grandmother Patricia Morrison in 2017. The company is currently valued at approximately $23 billion, with primary holdings in pharmaceutical development, medical equipment manufacturing, and healthcare facility management." The website displayed on Robert's screen showed a professional photograph of Sarah, not the casual librarian they knew, but Sarah in a tailored business suit, her hair styled perfectly, standing in front of a corporate logo that Helen vaguely recognized from buildings throughout the city. "Sarah Morrison Chen, CEO and majority shareholder," the caption read. "Leading the next generation of Morrison family innovation." Helen felt her world tilting, all her assumptions about her daughter-in-law rearranging themselves into a pattern that made terrible sense. The way Sarah had always had money for groceries even when Marcus complained about his salary. The way she'd never seemed worried about bills or expenses. The anonymous foundation that had appeared exactly when they'd needed it most, just months after Marcus and Sarah's wedding. "She's been paying for everything," Helen whispered, the realization crushing her with shame so profound that she wanted to disappear. "The dialysis, your father's treatments, Melissa's procedures. Sarah's been keeping us alive, and we treated her like she was lucky to be part of our family." Marcus was pulling up his phone, searching for Sarah's name, finding dozens of articles about Morrison Medical Ventures and its young CEO, about philanthropic initiatives and medical research funding and corporate acquisitions, including the purchase of Chen Pharmaceuticals 2 years ago. Each article featured photos of Sarah looking powerful and accomplished and nothing like the quiet woman who'd sat in waiting rooms with Helen, reading romance novels and eating vending machine snacks while Helen underwent treatment. "I need to talk to her," Marcus said, his voice cracking with panic that Helen had never heard from her confident son. "I need to explain. I didn't know. If I'd known she was, I didn't know." "You didn't know she was worth knowing until you found out she was worth $23 billion? Robert asked quietly, and Helen heard judgment in his tone that she couldn't argue with. "Your mother has a treatment scheduled in 20 minutes. Without insurance or payment arrangements, we cannot provide it. You have 3 options. Pay $6,000 today for a single session, establish a payment plan with our billing department, or seek treatment at a county facility that accepts uninsured patients." Marcus was already dialing Sarah's number, his fingers fumbling on the screen as he tried to call the wife he'd divorced 3 days ago, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. A third time, and Helen watched her son's hands shake as he realized that Sarah wasn't going to answer, that the woman he'd served with divorce papers while she was pregnant with his child had no interest in hearing his excuses or explanations. "She blocked me," Marcus said, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. "She actually blocked my number." "Can you blame her?" Helen asked, and she heard her own voice breaking with shame and horror at what her son had done. "You divorced her, Marcus. You served her with papers in a hospital courtyard while she was pregnant. And now you want to call and ask for favors? What kind of man did I raise?" "I didn't know," Marcus shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "She lied to me. She pretended to be nobody. She let me think she was just a librarian working part-time for something to do. How was I supposed to know she was secretly running a billion-dollar company?" "Why would it matter?" Robert interrupted, his professional demeanor slipping to reveal real anger. You married her when you thought she was a librarian. You divorced her when you thought she was a librarian. The only thing that's changed is you now know she has money. If you loved her, her net worth shouldn't matter. And if you didn't love her, you shouldn't have married her in the first place. Helen stood on shaking legs, her body protesting the stress and mistreatment, her mind reeling from revelations that had destroyed every assumption she'd built about her family's situation. Take me home, Marcus. I need to talk to your father. We need to figure out what we've done and how to fix it. What about your treatment? Marcus asked desperately. You need dialysis. You can't just skip it. I'll go to County General, Helen said quietly. Like people without money or connections do. Like I should have been doing all along instead of accepting charity I didn't appreciate and didn't deserve. The drive home took 20 minutes through afternoon traffic, neither of them speaking as Marcus navigated streets he'd driven 1,000 times but which now felt unfamiliar, as if the revelation about Sarah had somehow altered the fundamental geography of his life. Helen stared out the window watching the city pass by, and thought about all the times Sarah had offered to help, to contribute more financially, and Helen had brushed her off with comments about keeping her little library job if it made her happy, never suspecting that Sarah's part-time work was cover for managing billions in assets. David Chen was in his home office when they arrived, reviewing medical bills that Sarah had actually been paying while the Chen family believed they were managing their own expenses. He looked up as Helen and Marcus entered, his expression moving from surprise at their early return to concern as he registered Helen's expression. What happened? David asked, standing immediately. Is your dialysis okay? Did something go wrong at the hospital? Everything went wrong, Helen said, sinking into the leather chair that Sarah had helped them pick out 2 years ago when they'd redecorated. Everything has been wrong for years and we were too blind to see it. She told him everything. The foundation termination. The hospital administrator's revelation. The corporate website showing Sarah in business suits they'd never seen her wear. The $47,000 monthly payments their family had been receiving without knowing the source. And most devastating of all, Marcus's divorce filing that had triggered the end of everything they'd been taking for granted. David listened in silence, his face growing paler with each revelation, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if trying to anchor himself against news that kept getting worse. When Helen finished, he turned to Marcus with an expression of disappointment so profound that Marcus actually stepped backward. You divorced her, David said, his voice flat and emotionless in the way it got when he was truly angry. You divorced the woman who saved our family. Who saved my life when the insurance company denied my cancer treatment. Who gave your mother 15 years of additional life that she wouldn't have had otherwise. You divorced her while she's pregnant with our grandchild. And you did it for Rebecca Martinez, a woman whose entire value to you is her connections and ambition. I didn't know Sarah was rich, Marcus protested, but his defense sounded weak even to his own ears. She never told me. She lied about who she was. She tested you, David corrected, his voice cutting through Marcus's excuses like a scalpel. She wanted to know if you'd love her for who she was rather than what she could provide. And you failed that test so completely that you divorced her the moment you thought she had no value to offer you, never once stopping to question how a part-time librarian could afford the life you were living. Helen felt tears starting to fall, finally breaking through the shock that had held them back in the hospital. We called her useless. I told her she was lucky Marcus had married her, that she should be grateful to be part of our family. And all the while she was keeping us alive, paying for treatments we couldn't afford, saving David's company from bankruptcy, and never saying a word. Chen Pharmaceuticals, David whispered, another piece falling into place. Morrison Medical Ventures bought us 2 years ago. Sarah bought my company. She saved 800 jobs, restructured our debt, and I thought it was just good fortune. Anonymous investors who saw potential. But it was her. Our daughter-in-law was the mysterious savior I thanked God for every night. Marcus had collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him as he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. I need to fix this. I need to call her, explain that I didn't understand, that if I'd known. If you'd known she was a billionaire, you wouldn't have divorced her? Helen interrupted, her voice sharp with the clarity that came from seeing her son completely clearly for the first time in years. That's what you want to tell her? That her money makes her worth loving? That you're sorry for discarding her when you thought she was worthless, but now that you know her net worth, you'd like to reconsider? That's not what I meant, Marcus said, but his protest lacked conviction because they all knew that was exactly what he meant, that the man who'd served divorce papers 3 days ago would never have filed them if he'd known Sarah controlled billions. Helen's phone buzzed with a text message, and she looked down to see an unknown number. Mrs. Chen, this is Victoria Martinez from Morrison Medical Ventures Legal Department. Mrs. Sarah Morrison Chen has requested that I inform you directly that all charitable distributions to the Chen family have been permanently terminated. Additionally, Morrison Medical Ventures will be reviewing its acquisition of Chen Pharmaceuticals to determine if the transaction should be reversed, which would return operational control to David Chen along with the $340 million in debt and legal liabilities that existed at the time of purchase. Mrs. Chen wanted me to tell you that she wishes you well in finding alternative medical care arrangements, and that she bears no ill will toward your family despite the circumstances of her marriage ending. She asks only that you not attempt to contact her directly, as she needs space to heal and focus on preparing for her child's arrival. The message was professional and courteous and absolutely devastating in its implications. Sarah wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was simply withdrawing all the support she'd been providing, removing herself from their lives completely, and leaving them to face the reality of their situation without her safety net. She's going to reverse the acquisition, David said, his voice hollow with understanding. She's going to give me back my company and with it all the debt and legal problems that were destroying us before she bought it. We'll lose everything. Can she do that? Marcus asked desperately. Can she just reverse a corporate acquisition because she's angry about a divorce? She can do whatever she wants, Helen said, the full weight of their dependence finally crushing her with shame. She owns everything, Marcus. Everything we thought we'd built ourselves was actually built by her. Your father's company. My medical care. Melissa's treatments. Even this house. Did we ever ask how we could afford it on your father's salary after the company was struggling? They sat in silence as that revelation settled over them, each person processing the ways they'd been blind to Sarah's generosity, too caught up in their own assumptions about her modest presentation to question the financial reality that didn't match her supposed income. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he looked at it with desperate hope that died when he saw it was Rebecca calling. He let it go to voicemail, unable to face the woman he'd left his wife for, the relationship that had seemed so important 3 days ago but now felt like evidence of catastrophic judgment. What do we do? Melissa Chen asked from the doorway, and they all turned to see Marcus's sister standing there with tears streaming down her face. I just got a letter from the fertility clinic. The foundation terminated my treatment coverage. I'm in the middle of a cycle. If I don't complete it, we've wasted 6 months of preparation and $30,000 of medications that are already in my system. And without the foundation, I can't afford the final procedures. Helen looked at her daughter, at the desperation in her eyes, and felt guilt so profound it made her physically ill. Melissa had struggled with infertility for 5 years, had endured countless procedures and hormone treatments and failed attempts to conceive, and Sarah had quietly covered everything, giving Melissa hope for a family while Marcus's family had dismissed Sarah as an inadequate wife who should feel grateful for their acceptance. Sarah was paying for everything, Helen told Melissa, watching her daughter's face crumble with the same shame and horror they all felt. Morrison Medical Ventures, the foundation that's been covering your treatments, is run by Sarah. And Marcus just divorced her while she's 6 months pregnant with his child. Melissa turned to her brother with an expression of betrayal so complete that Marcus actually flinched. You divorced Sarah? While she was pregnant? The woman who's been paying for my fertility treatments, who's been giving me the chance to have a baby, and you divorced her for Rebecca? What is wrong with you? I didn't know. Marcus shouted, his composure finally breaking completely. Nobody told me Sarah was some secret billionaire. She worked in a library. She drove an old car. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know, David said quietly. That was the entire point. She wanted you to love her for who she was, not what she could provide. And you proved that you couldn't do that. You proved that the moment you thought she had no value, you discarded her. And now you want to fix it because you found out she's rich? That's not love, Marcus. That's not even basic human decency. That's just greed wearing a mask of regret. The doorbell rang, interrupting the family crisis, and Helen stood on shaking legs to answer it, finding 2 people in professional attire standing on her porch with tablets and leather portfolios that screamed corporate authority. Mrs. Helen Chen? The woman asked, her voice professional but not unkind. I'm Jennifer Walsh from Morrison Medical Ventures. This is my colleague Robert Kim. We're here to discuss the transition of your medical care and your family's financial obligations now that the foundation support has been terminated. Helen let them in, her body moving automatically while her mind struggled to process that this was actually happening, that Sarah had sent corporate representatives to her home to formalize the end of the charity that had been keeping her alive. They gathered in the living room, the Morrison medical representatives sitting across from the Chen family like prosecutors facing defendants, their tablets displaying documents and financial statements that Helen couldn't quite focus on through her tears. Morrison Medical Ventures has prepared a comprehensive summary of all charitable distributions provided to the Chen family over the past 2 years, Jennifer began, scrolling through her tablet with practiced efficiency. Total contributions amount to $1,127,000, covering dialysis treatments for Mrs. Helen Chen, oncology care and medications for Mr. David Chen, fertility treatments for Miss Melissa Chen, and various ancillary medical expenses for all family members. The number hung in the air like an accusation, and Helen felt her breath catch in her chest. Over $1 million. Sarah had given them over $1 million and they'd never known, never thanked her properly, never appreciated the magnitude of the gift they'd been receiving. Additionally, Jennifer continued, Morrison Medical Ventures holds controlling interest in Chen Pharmaceuticals, acquired 2 years ago for $340 million. The company has been operating successfully under Morrison Medical Management, with profits of approximately $47 million annually. However, Mrs. Sarah Morrison Chen is considering returning operational control to Mr. David Chen, which would also return the associated debts and legal liabilities that existed at the time of acquisition. David made a sound like something dying, and Helen reached for his hand, gripping his fingers with desperate strength as they faced the reality of losing everything they'd rebuilt with Sarah's help. "We need to speak with Sarah," Marcus said, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is all a misunderstanding. If I could just explain." Mrs. Morrison Chen has been very clear that she does not wish to have contact with any member of the Chen family, Robert interrupted firmly. "She's instructed us to handle all communication through official corporate channels. However, she has asked us to convey that she understands the medical implications of terminating coverage, and she's arranged for transitional support to help you establish alternative care arrangements." Jennifer pulled out several documents and laid them on the coffee table. Morrison Medical has negotiated reduced rates with County General Hospital for Mrs. Chen's dialysis. You'll pay 40% of the normal cost, which comes to approximately $7,200 per month. We've also arranged a payment plan option with the hospital that will allow you to spread the cost over 18 months without interest. $7,200 a month, Helen whispered. "We can't afford that. Even with the payment plan, we can't afford that on David's salary. Mr. Chen's salary from Chen Pharmaceuticals is currently $180,000 annually," Robert noted, checking his tablet. "If Morrison Medical returns operational control of the company, that salary would likely decrease to whatever the company could afford to pay, assuming it survives the transition." The implications were clear: accept Sarah's transitional help and struggle with reduced but manageable medical costs, or refuse it and face complete financial collapse when Morrison Medical reversed the pharmaceutical acquisition. "Why is she doing this?" Melissa asked, her voice small and broken. "Why is she helping us at all after what Marcus did? After how we all treated her?" Jennifer and Robert exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them before Jennifer spoke again. "Mrs. Morrison Chen wanted us to tell you that she doesn't believe in punishing sick people for their family members' failures. She doesn't want Mrs. Helen Chen to die because Mr. Marcus Chen made poor choices in his marriage. She doesn't want Mr. David Chen's employees to lose their jobs because his son lacks character. But she also won't continue enabling a family that treated her with disrespect and took her generosity for granted. The transitional support is our compromise," Robert added. "Reduced costs that your family can actually afford if you make sacrifices. Payment plans that won't destroy you but also won't be comfortable. Medical care that will keep you alive but will require you to appreciate what it costs instead of taking it for granted." Helen felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by Sarah's mercy and devastated by her own blindness. "Please tell her we're sorry. Please tell her we didn't know, and if we had." "With respect, Mrs. Chen," Jennifer interrupted gently, "you did know. You knew Sarah was a kind person who sat with you during dialysis. You knew she helped with your groceries when money was tight. You knew she never asked for anything in return. What you didn't know was that she had money, and apparently, that's the only thing that would have made you treat her with respect." The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Helen couldn't argue because it was completely true. They dismissed Sarah as insignificant because she'd presented herself as ordinary, never once questioning how that ordinary woman could afford the life they were living or where the money for their medical care was actually coming from. Mrs. Morrison Chen's attorney will contact you regarding the divorce proceedings, Robert said, standing to signal the meeting was ending. She's requesting full custody of the child with supervised visitation rights for Mr. Marcus Chen. She's not seeking child support, given her financial position, but she is requesting that Mr. Chen voluntarily terminate his parental rights to avoid future complications. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and desperation. She can't take my child. I have rights. I didn't know she was rich when I filed for divorce. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean she can steal my baby. You filed for divorce while she was 6 months pregnant, Jennifer said, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal real anger. You served her papers in a hospital courtyard while your mother was receiving dialysis that your wife was secretly paying for. You were planning to marry your mistress in December. And now you want to claim parental rights to a child you were ready to abandon? What exactly do you think a judge will say about that? Marcus had no answer, his mouth opening and closing without producing words, and Helen watched her son finally understand that his actions had consequences he couldn't charm or negotiate his way out of. Jennifer and Robert left with professional courtesy, leaving the Chen family sitting in silence among the documents they'd provided, detailed summaries of every dollar Sarah had spent keeping them afloat, every treatment she'd covered, every bill she'd paid while they treated her like she should be grateful for their acceptance. What do we do now? Melissa finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We accept her help, David said quietly. We take the reduced rates and the payment plans, and we figure out how to actually afford our lives instead of depending on charity we didn't appreciate. And we let Marcus deal with the consequences of his choices. Marcus was already on his phone, scrolling through divorce attorneys and custody lawyers, his mind clearly working through how to fight Sarah for rights to a child he'd been ready to abandon just days ago. But Helen saw the calculation in his eyes and knew that her son wasn't motivated by love for his unborn baby but by rage at losing access to Sarah's money. You should let her have full custody, Helen told her son, her voice harder than she'd ever used with him. You don't deserve that baby. You don't deserve Sarah. And fighting her will only prove that you care more about winning than about doing what's right. She's my child. Marcus protested. I have a right to be a father. You have a right to nothing, David corrected sharply. You terminated those rights when you served divorce papers to a pregnant woman. Sarah's offering you supervised visitation, which is more generous than you deserve. Take it, sign whatever papers her attorneys send, and maybe, if you spend the next 18 years proving you've changed, your daughter might actually want to know you. The use of daughter hit Marcus visibly, the reality that Sarah was pregnant with his child finally seeming to penetrate through his calculations about money and rights and what he was entitled to receive. Helen's phone buzzed again, another message from an unknown number, but this time the text made her breath catch. Mrs. Chen, this is Sarah. I asked my attorneys not to give you my number, but I wanted to tell you directly that I don't hate you or your family. I'm hurt and disappointed, but I understand that Marcus made his choices, not you. I'm making sure you have access to medical care because you deserve to live, regardless of your son's failures. But I can't be part of your family anymore. I can't sit in that waiting room and pretend we're okay when your son is marrying the woman he left me for. I hope you understand. Take care of yourself. Sarah. Helen read the message 3 times, her tears falling onto the phone screen, overwhelmed by Sarah's grace and devastated by her own failure to see the treasure they'd had in their family until it was gone. Over the following months, Sarah Morrison Chen prepared for motherhood while simultaneously managing the public relations crisis of her divorce from Marcus Chen. Business journals ran stories about the billionaire CEO whose husband had left her while pregnant, turning Sarah into an unlikely symbol of women betrayed by men who underestimated them. Sarah handled the attention with characteristic grace, giving no interviews about her personal life while making strategic corporate announcements that demonstrated Morrison Medical Ventures' continued strength and growth. She increased the company's charitable healthcare initiatives, expanded their pharmaceutical research divisions, and announced a new foundation focused specifically on supporting pregnant women who'd been abandoned by their partners. The foundation, called Grace Harbor, provided medical care, legal support, temporary housing, and job placement services for women facing pregnancy alone, and Sarah made it clear in the announcement that this was personal, that she understood what it felt like to face motherhood without the partner who'd promised to stand beside her. Marcus tried everything to contact her. Emails that bounced back unread, flowers sent to her office that were donated to local hospitals, letters hand-delivered by courier that were returned unopened. His desperation grew as he watched Rebecca Martinez distance herself from him, her ambition apparently not extending to men who'd lost access to billion-dollar connections. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Sarah's attorneys presented documentation of Marcus's affair, his plan to marry Rebecca immediately after the divorce, and his pattern of dismissing Sarah's contributions to their marriage. Marcus's attorneys tried to argue that he'd been deceived about Sarah's wealth, but the judge's expression made it clear what he thought of that defense. Full custody was granted to Sarah, with Marcus receiving supervised visitation rights every other weekend once the baby was 6 months old. No child support was ordered, given Sarah's financial position, but Marcus was required to maintain health insurance for the child and contribute to a college fund. Sarah gave birth to a daughter in February, a healthy 8-pound baby girl with dark hair and determined lungs who announced her arrival with impressive volume. Sarah named her Grace Catherine Morrison, giving her daughter the middle name of Marcus's mother, not as a gift to the Chen family but as an acknowledgement that Helen was still a part of her daughter's heritage, regardless of what had happened between their families. Helen received a birth announcement in the mail, a simple card with Grace's footprints and birth statistics, and a handwritten note from Sarah. "Your granddaughter is healthy and beautiful. When she's old enough to ask about her father's family, I'll tell her the truth, that you're good people who made mistakes, and that family is complicated. If you'd like to meet her, let me know. But please understand that I can't have Marcus at any gathering, at least not yet. Sarah." Helen cried for an hour after reading that note, overwhelmed by Sarah's continued grace and her own undeserved second chance. She responded immediately, accepting the offer to meet her granddaughter while respecting Sarah's boundaries about Marcus's presence. Their first meeting happened at Morrison Medical's corporate offices, neutral territory where Sarah felt safe and in control. Helen arrived with David, both of them nervous and uncertain, and found Sarah in a conference room that had been converted into a temporary nursery, Grace sleeping peacefully in a bassinet while Sarah reviewed documents on her laptop. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, standing to greet them with professional courtesy that felt more painful than anger would have been. "Grace has been sleeping for about 20 minutes. She should wake up soon." They sat in awkward silence, years of family dinners and holidays reduced to stilted small talk between virtual strangers. Helen wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make Sarah understand that they'd never meant to hurt her, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate. "How are your treatments going?" Sarah asked finally, breaking the silence with characteristic directness. "The county hospital is fine," Helen answered, surprised by the question. "The dialysis works the same regardless of where I receive it. Your negotiated rates have made it manageable, and we're keeping up with the payment plan. I wanted to thank you for that. You didn't have to help us at all after what Marcus did." "I didn't do it for Marcus," Sarah said quietly. "I did it because you're a person who deserves medical care, and because punishing sick people for their children's failures isn't who I want to be." Grace stirred in her bassinet, making the small sounds that preceded waking, and Sarah stood to lift her daughter with practiced ease, cradling her against her shoulder as Grace's eyes opened to reveal dark irises that would probably turn brown or hazel as she grew older. "Would you like to hold her?" Sarah asked, extending Grace toward Helen, and Helen took her granddaughter with trembling hands, looking down at the perfect tiny face and feeling her heart break with love and regret in equal measure. David moved closer, his hand gentle on Grace's head, his eyes filling with tears as he looked at his first grandchild, the baby who should have been celebrated by their whole family but instead existed in this fractured reality where her parents couldn't be in the same room. "She looks like Marcus did as a baby," David said softly. "Same serious expression. Same little frown when she's thinking." Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth Helen had seen from her since they'd arrived. "She's very determined. The nurses said she's the most focused baby they've seen. Knows exactly what she wants and won't settle for anything less." "Like her mother," Helen said, and Sarah's smile faded slightly as she registered the compliment from a woman who'd once dismissed her as insignificant. They stayed for an hour, holding Grace and making careful conversation, and when it was time to leave, Sarah walked them to the elevator with Grace in her arms, her expression unreadable. "You can visit once a month," Sarah said as they waited for the elevator to arrive. "I'll have my assistant coordinate schedules. But please understand that this doesn't mean we're family again. This is about Grace having the chance to know her grandparents, not about reconciliation." "We understand," Helen said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And Sarah, I just want you to know that we're sorry. We're so sorry for how we treated you, for not seeing what you were giving us, for taking you for granted. If we could go back and do things differently." "But you can't," Sarah interrupted gently. "None of us can. We can only move forward and try to make better choices. That's what I'm doing." I'm focusing on being the best mother I can be for Grace and the best CEO I can be for Morrison Medical. Everything else is just noise. The elevator arrived, and Helen stepped inside with David, turning back to see Sarah standing there holding Grace, 2 generations of Morrison women who would build their lives without the Chen family's presence, except for carefully supervised monthly visits that felt more like duty than connection. As the elevator descended, Helen finally understood what Sarah had been trying to teach them all along. That worth wasn't measured in money or social connections or prestigious family names, but in how people treated each other when there was nothing to gain, in the choices they made when character was tested, in the grace they showed to people who'd failed them. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen sat in the apartment he'd moved into after losing the house, his mother's medical bills spread across a kitchen table that had come from IKEA rather than the designer furniture store Sarah had favored, and he calculated exactly how much his life had cost before he'd discovered Sarah's wealth. $7,200 per month for his mother's dialysis. Another $4,000 for his father's cancer medications. $2,800 for his sister's fertility treatments. $6,500 for the mortgage on a house he no longer owned. $2,000 for car payments on vehicles that had been in Sarah's name. The numbers added up to more than his current salary could support, forcing him to recognize that his comfortable life had been subsidized by the wife he'd divorced. Rebecca Martinez had stopped returning his calls after the divorce finalized, her interest in Marcus apparently connected to his perceived connections rather than any genuine affection. She'd been promoted at her job, moved to a corner office, and started dating a senior partner who could actually advance her career in ways Marcus never could have. His colleagues at the hospital whispered when he walked by, everyone knowing about the billionaire wife he'd left while she was pregnant, about the medical care his family had been receiving without knowing the source, about his current attempts to fight for custody of a child he'd been ready to abandon. The supervised visitation started when Grace was 6 months old, every other weekend for 4 hours at Morrison Medical's corporate offices under the watchful eye of a social worker named Patricia who documented every interaction and filed detailed reports with the family court. Marcus held his daughter with awkward unfamiliarity, uncertain how to connect with an infant who'd spent her entire life hearing only her mother's voice, who had no recognition of him as anyone significant in her small world. Grace would cry for Sarah, reaching her tiny hands toward her mother, and Marcus would feel the weight of his failures crushing him as Patricia made notes about inability to soothe infant and lack of established bond. Sarah would sit across the room during these visits, working on her laptop while remaining close enough to intervene if needed, her presence a constant reminder that she was Grace's primary parent, that Marcus was a guest in his daughter's life rather than a central figure. "She's beautiful," Marcus said during one visit, holding Grace while she squirmed and fussed, clearly wanting to return to her mother. "She is," Sarah agreed, not looking up from her laptop. "I made a mistake," Marcus continued, the words he'd been practicing for months finally emerging in the presence of the woman he'd destroyed his life to leave. "I was an idiot. I didn't appreciate what I had. If I could go back and do things differently." "You'd what?" Sarah interrupted, finally looking at him with eyes that held no warmth. "You'd stay married to me because you found out I'm rich? That's not love, Marcus. That's not even regret. That's just disappointment that you lost access to money." "That's not what I meant," Marcus protested, but his defense sounded hollow even to himself. "Then what did you mean?" Sarah challenged. "Did you suddenly develop feelings for the librarian you divorced? Or did those feelings only return when you found out she was a billionaire?" Grace started crying in earnest, her tiny face scrunching with distress, and Sarah stood to take her daughter from Marcus's arms, settling Grace against her shoulder with practiced ease. Grace's cries subsided almost immediately, soothed by her mother's familiar voice and scent. "Your 4 hours are up," Patricia said, checking her watch. "Same time in 2 weeks?" Marcus nodded, watching Sarah gather Grace's diaper bag and prepare to leave, and he felt the familiar crushing realization that this was his life now, a visitor in his daughter's existence, forever marked as the man who'd abandoned her mother while pregnant. "Sarah, wait," Marcus called as she headed for the door. "Can we talk? Really talk? Not about custody or visitation but about us, about what happened." Sarah turned back, Grace settled comfortably on her hip, and Marcus saw in her eyes that she'd already moved past him, that whatever feelings she'd once had were buried under layers of betrayal and disappointment. "There is no us, Marcus. There's you and there's me, and there's Grace who deserves better than parents who can barely speak civilly to each other. You made your choice when you served me divorce papers at my father's funeral. You reinforced that choice every time you flaunted Rebecca in public. You cemented it when you tried to fight for custody only after learning about my money. I've moved on. I suggest you do the same." She left without waiting for his response, and Marcus stood alone in the conference room with Patricia packing up her notes, the social worker's expression making it clear what she thought of fathers who only wanted their children after discovering their mothers were billionaires. Years passed. Grace grew into a bright, determined child who loved her mother fiercely and tolerated her father's supervised visits with polite indifference. Marcus remained a peripheral figure in her life, the man who came every other weekend and tried too hard to be interesting, who brought expensive gifts that Grace accepted with perfunctory thanks before returning her attention to whatever book or project she'd been working on. Helen and David visited monthly, building a careful relationship with their granddaughter that respected Sarah's boundaries while allowing Grace to know her father's family. Helen's health remained stable on the reduced-cost dialysis, and David's cancer went into remission, giving them both the gift of additional years they wouldn't have had without Sarah's intervention. Melissa eventually became pregnant through IVF treatments she'd paid for herself, having learned from Sarah's example that accepting charity without appreciation led to entitled dependence. She named her daughter Sarah in honor of the sister-in-law who'd given her hope when she'd needed it most, and she made sure her daughter knew the story of the aunt who'd been treated poorly but responded with grace. Morrison Medical Ventures continued to thrive under Sarah's leadership, growing from $23 billion to $41 billion over 10 years, and Sarah used her wealth to fund medical research, build free clinics in underserved communities, and support programs for single mothers facing pregnancy alone. She dated occasionally, men who knew about her wealth from the beginning and either loved her anyway or revealed themselves as fortune seekers she could dismiss immediately. But she never remarried, too focused on Grace and her company to invest emotional energy in relationships that might prove as disappointing as her marriage had been. Grace Morrison graduated from Stanford at 21, summa cum laude with degrees in biomedical engineering and business administration, and immediately joined Morrison Medical as a junior researcher. She'd grown up understanding that privilege came with responsibility, that wealth was a tool rather than a trophy, and that character revealed itself in how people treated those who couldn't benefit them. At her graduation party, surrounded by family and friends and colleagues who'd watched her grow from infant to accomplished young woman, Grace stood to give a speech that reduced many attendees to tears. "My mother taught me that the measure of a person isn't their net worth or their social connections, but how they treat people when there's nothing to gain," Grace began, looking directly at Sarah. "She showed me that grace isn't just a name but a choice, the choice to help people who've hurt you, to give second chances to families who failed you, to build a life focused on making the world better rather than seeking revenge on people who made mistakes." She paused, her eyes finding Marcus in the back of the room, present at Sarah's invitation despite years of supervised visits and careful distance. "My father made terrible choices 21 years ago. He hurt my mother when she was vulnerable and pregnant and grieving her own father. He chose ambition over love, wealth over character, and pride over humility. But my mother chose to respond with grace, ensuring that my grandmother received medical care despite my father's betrayal, building a relationship with his family despite having every reason to cut them off completely, and allowing me to know my father even though he'd proven himself unworthy of that privilege." Marcus was crying openly now, years of guilt and regret finally breaking through the defenses he'd maintained since the divorce, and Grace's next words hit him like physical blows. "I want to thank my mother for showing me what real strength looks like. Not the strength to destroy people who've wronged you, but the strength to remain kind when kindness isn't deserved, to help when help isn't appreciated, and to build a life focused on who you are rather than what was done to you. Thank you for being the parent I deserved even when my father chose to be absent. Thank you for being the example I needed, even when it would have been easier to be bitter. Thank you for teaching me that grace is a choice we make every day, in every interaction regardless of whether people deserve it." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah stood to embrace her daughter, 21 years of single parenthood culminating in this moment of recognition and pride. Grace had become everything Sarah had hoped she'd be: intelligent, compassionate, driven by purpose rather than profit, committed to using her advantages to help others rather than simply accumulating more wealth. Marcus approached them after the speeches ended, his expression uncertain as he faced the woman he'd divorced and the daughter he'd barely been permitted to know. "Grace, that was beautiful. Sarah, I just wanted to say—" "Thank you for coming," Sarah interrupted gently, not unkindly, but making it clear that she had no interest in whatever Marcus wanted to say. "It means a lot to Grace that you're here." "It does," Grace confirmed, but her tone was polite rather than warm, the voice of someone acknowledging a distant relative rather than a beloved father. "I appreciate you making the effort." Marcus nodded, recognizing the dismissal for what it was, and moved away to join his parents across the room, leaving Sarah and Grace to celebrate together, mother and daughter who'd built a life defined by grace rather than bitterness, by choices to help rather than harm, by understanding that the greatest revenge against betrayal was building something beautiful from the ruins. Helen watched from her table, her hand in David's, both of them grateful for the monthly visits they'd been permitted, for the relationship with Grace they'd been allowed to build, and for Sarah's continued willingness to see them as family despite everything that had happened. "She's remarkable," David said, watching Grace laugh with her mother. "Just like Sarah." "She is," Helen agreed. "And we almost lost them both because we couldn't see value in someone who presented themselves as ordinary." "What does that say about us?" "It says we learned," David replied. "Maybe too late to fix everything but early enough to be better going forward." "That's something." Sarah overheard the conversation and felt the familiar mix of pain and acceptance that characterized her relationship with Marcus's family. They had learned. They had changed. But some wounds ran too deep to fully heal, some betrayals cut too close to the bone to simply forgive and forget. She'd given them grace, access to their granddaughter, reduced medical costs that saved their lives, professional courtesy despite personal pain. But she'd also maintained boundaries that protected herself and Grace from further hurt, recognizing that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, that moving forward didn't mean pretending the past hadn't happened. As the party continued into the evening, Sarah stood on the balcony of Morrison Medical's event space, looking out over the city where she'd built her empire, raised her daughter, and transformed personal betrayal into corporate success and philanthropic impact. She thought about the scared, pregnant woman she'd been 21 years ago, standing in a hospital courtyard holding divorce papers and wondering how to survive. That woman had been stronger than she'd known. Braver than circumstances suggested. More capable than anyone, including herself, had believed possible. And she'd raised a daughter who embodied those same qualities, who understood that true power came not from wealth or social position but from choosing grace over bitterness, help over harm, and building a life defined by who you wanted to be rather than what had been done to you. Sarah had set out to write a story about betrayal and medical bills and family secrets. But she'd ended up writing one about resilience and second chances and the surprising strength that emerges when people face their worst moments and choose grace anyway. And that, she thought as Grace joined her on the balcony and wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders, was worth more than all the billions Morrison Medical Ventures would ever generate. More valuable than every property she owned or company she'd acquired or victory she'd won in the corporate world. She'd been betrayed by the man she loved while pregnant and grieving. But she'd emerged stronger, built a life that mattered, and raised a daughter who would change the world not because of inherited wealth but because of inherited values that Sarah had modeled every day through choices both large and small. The Chens had taught her what family shouldn't be: conditional acceptance, taking without appreciation, valuing wealth over character. But Grace had shown her what family could be: unconditional love, mutual respect, building something together that was stronger than either person alone. And that transformation, from betrayed wife to empowered CEO, from broken-hearted single mother to proud parent of an accomplished daughter, was the real story worth telling. Not the revenge that could have destroyed the Chen family completely, but the grace that had allowed them to survive while maintaining dignity. Not the bitterness that would have poisoned Sarah's soul, but the choice to build something beautiful from ruins. Not the wealth that had always been hers, but the character she'd developed through surviving betrayal with grace intact. As mother and daughter stood together looking out over the city, Sarah felt grateful not for the billions she controlled but for the choices she'd made, the daughter she'd raised, and the life she'd built by choosing grace over revenge, every single day, regardless of whether it was deserved.